The research station orbited a small blue planet that the locals called Earth, and Dr. Zara had been observing it. For 3 cycles, Nosh was a xenobiologist from the Etherian Empire, and her species had been studying primitive worlds for centuries. But something about these humans fascinated her in ways she could not explain to her colleague. Skin shimmered with soft purple hues, and her large eyes could see spectrums of light that humans could only dream about, and she stood nearly 7 feet tall with a graceful build that made movement seem like floating. The council had sent her here with one specific mission: to understand human reproduction for scientific purposes, because humans were spreading across their solar system faster than any species they had encountered, and the Empire needed to know. Zara had collected data for months through remote observation and atmospheric sampling, but the more she learned, the less she understood, because human bonding patterns made no logical sense, and their emotional connections seemed to defy all known biological imperatives. In evening, she made a decision that would change everything, and she would conduct a direct field study. Took a shuttle down to the surface and landed near a small town in what humans called Colorado, and her adaptive camouflage technology made her appear almost human, though her height still drew attention. The local establishment was called a bar, and inside she found exactly what she needed. His name was Jake, and he worked at the construction site outside town, and he had kind brown eyes and strong hands that were calloused from honest work. Zara approached him with her best approximation of human social behavior, and she smiled the way she had practiced and said hello in perfect English. Jake looked up from his drink, and his eyes widened slightly, because even with the camouflage, she was striking in a way he could not quite place it. He talked for hours about simple things, and he told her about building houses, and she told him she was a researcher from out of town, which was technically true. When he invited her back to his place, she agreed because this was why she came, and her scientific curiosity demanded answers. What happened next defied every piece of data she had collected. Men's physical intimacy was not just a biological function, and it was an art form. And Jake touched her with a gentleness that made her camouflage flicker, and when he kissed her neck, she felt her 3 hearts accelerate in ways her species had not experienced in millennia. The act itself was overwhelming, and humans had somehow evolved to make reproduction pleasurable in ways that transcended mere nerve stimulation. And Jake was patient and attentive, and when she made sounds she had never made before, he seemed to understand what she needed without her having to explain. Her legs trembled, and her advanced biology could not compensate for the waves of sensation, and when it was over, she lay there unable to move, and a smile spreading across her face that she could not control. Jake fell asleep beside her, and his arm draped over her waist, and Zara stared at the ceiling and processed what had happened. This was not supposed to affect her like this, and she was a scientist, and this was research, but her body disagreed with every fiber. When morning came, she tried to stand, and her legs wobbled, and Jake woke up and asked if she was okay, and she nodded, but the smile was still there. She returned to his place the next night and told herself it was for additional data points, but she knew that was a leaf. Second time was even more intense, because now she knew what to expect, and Jake seemed determined to exceed her expectations. And he did things with his mouth that made her forget she was from an advanced civilization. The third night, she could barely walk back to her shuttle, and her research notes were becoming less scientific and more poetic. Problem was that human breeding, as they called it, was addictive in ways her species had engineered out of themselves, and humans had kept the raw, passionate chaos of it. And Zara was discovering she had been missing something fundamental her entire life. Weeks passed, and she kept returning to Jake, and each time she told herself it was the last time, and each time she found herself back in his arms. Her colleagues started asking questions because her reports were late, and when she finally submitted them, they were unusually brief. Dr. Zara, what are your findings on human reproduction patterns? They are highly effective, she wrote, and recommend further studies. Started spending more time on the surface than in orbit, and Jake introduced her to his friends. And she had to maintain her camouflage constantly, but it was worth it. Own evening, they went to something called a county fair, and Jake won her a stuffed animal by throwing balls at bottles, and she clutched it to her chest and felt emotions her. People had classified as inefficient, took her dancing, and she had studied human movement patterns, but nothing prepared her for the feeling of his hands on her hips and the music. Vibrating through both of them that night back at his place, he was especially gentle, and he looked into her eyes and said something that made her heart's Stoppy think, "I am falling for you, Zara." Had no protocol for this. And the Empire had never encountered a situation where a researcher developed emotional attachment to a subject, and her training said she should leave immediately, but her heart said something different. She decided to tell him the truth. Camouflage flickered and faded, and her true form emerged in purple skin and eyes that held galaxies and a height that made her tower over him. Jake sat up in bed, and his eyes went wide, but he did not scream, and he did not run, and he just stared at her for a long show. "Momento, you are an alienromance. You came here to study." Usa nodded slowly, and then he smiled. Does this mean the sex was research? Felt her face flush a deeper purple, and technically Yesh laughed, and it was a warm sound that filled the room. And okay then, thought, was it? And no fear and no anger, and just acceptance, and humans were extraordinary. "Should probably go back to my ship," she said. But she made no move to leave. "Okay," Jake said. "Or you could stay." Stayed. Months turned into years, and Zara filed minimal reports and claimed the study required extended observation. And technically she was still gathering data. Jake never asked her to be anything other than herself, and he introduced her to his family as his girlfriend from out of town, way out of town, and they accepted her once the initial shock wore off. Learned that human breeding was not just about reproduction, and it was about connection and trust and vulnerability, and every time she was with Jake, she understood a little more about why humans were special. Her people had optimized everything. It made reproduction clinical and efficient, but they had lost something in the process, and they had lost the joy of it. Zara still could not walk. Quite right after their intimate moments, and her legs would tremble, and that smile would spread across her face, and Jake would laugh and ask if she needed help. Every single time she would say no, and every single time she would accept his harmony. Day a message came from the Empire, and they wanted her to return and complete her mission. I looked at Jake sleeping beside her, and his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, and she made a decision. Sent a message back, and it was brief: mission complete, and human reproduction is effective due to emotional bonding and physical pleasure optimization, and researcher requesting permanent assignment to continue study. Council approved it because they assumed she was dedicated to science. Was dedicated but not to science. Any more years passed, and Zara learned to cook human food, and Jake learned to read ether and poetry, and they built a life together in that small Colorado town. Some of the times at night, she would look up at the stars and think about her home world, and then Jake would wrap his arms around her, and she would remember that home was not a place. Other researchers who came after her could not understand her reports because the data made no sense to them. But Zara knew the truth. Humans had figured out something that advanced civilizations had forgotten, and that pleasure and connection were not inefficient, and they were the point. And every time Jake made love to her, and she felt her legs turn to jelly, and that uncontrollable smile spread across her face, and she was grateful she had been sent to study humans' bows. They had taught her something far more valuable than science. Sethi had taught her how to live yon evening many years later. He sat on the porch and watched the sunset, and Zara held his hand and felt the calluses that were still Toreto. "You ever regret it?" He esketerit, "What, staying here and giving up your career for some random?" Humanch looked at him and smiled, that same smile she had worn since their first night together. He did not give up anything she said, and I found everything gained it was true, because the most important discovery she had ever made was not about human reproduction or biological compatibility. It was that love defied scientific explanation, and that some experiments were meant to last forever. Her legs still trembled when he touched her just right, and she still could not walk quite straight afterwards, and that smile still appeared unbidden. She would not have it any other way. Becca's Dr. Zara had come to Earth to study human breeding for science, but somewhere along the way she had stopped being a researcher and started being human in all the ways that Madaret's empire eventually sent other scientists, and they filed proper reports with proper data, and they never understood why Zara refused to return. Jake understood, and that was Anathi. Grew old together by human standards, though her lifespan was much longer, and she knew that someday she would have to say good boo, but that was a